Rejean, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me.
Well, listen, before we jump into talking all about marathon prep and your experiences in terms of at the elite level as well as with coaching athletes, can you tell listeners a little bit more about your background?
If I start very early on, growing up, I was more of a hockey player, and I started running a lot later, in my early 20s. So, I started playing hockey at 5. It's just really when I joined the Army and when I was 19 that I started running a little bit just because I had to because of the military.
Absolutely.
And it just kind of came naturally. So I did always enjoy it for some reason, but I never ran in high school or anything like that. I'm from the sticks in New Brunswick, so we didn't have a track team or anything like that. It really was just hockey and soccer.
And then at what point in your career there did you start to get the bug and realize that this is something you wanted to dive into a little further?
Yeah, well, I was injured in 2004, and I missed my tour to Haiti, and just all my buddies left to Haiti and all that stuff, and this group of guys that had a little running team just asked me to go for a run with them since they knew I did well on my physical fitness tests, and went out for a run, and they're like, yeah, you're sure you don't train for this? Yeah, no, not at all. They're like, you're pretty good. You should get in touch with a coach and all that stuff. And that's kind of how it started. And it was a very slow start those first few years. I was doing the typical beginner mistakes and always getting injured and stuff like that. But it's really just when I moved to Ottawa in 2006 that it seems like it increased my interest in it got a little higher and higher, and I started being a little bit more competitive locally, and I really enjoyed that.
And was there a certain distance that you started with, Rejean, in terms of competing, or did you get straight into the marathons? How did that play out?
No, it took quite a few years before I got to the marathon. When I started in 2004 in New Brunswick, I was running with this a little military team, which was mostly kids of military members. So they did a lot more track work. So I was actually doing 1,500 and 3,000 on a track.
Nice.
Which I'm pretty bad at on the shorter stuff. I'm definitely not a track runner. But it was a good way to get things going. Yeah, I'm very happy that I didn't start right away in a marathon. And so, that was 2004, and it took until 2011 before I did my first marathon. So in those early and middle years, I was really focusing more on 5K, 10K, and half marathon.
Nice. And now, if we use that as a jumping off point here to talk a little bit about some of the work you do with your clients. I mean, if we start at the beginner level, let's say, what are some of the principles or perhaps your training philosophy when you're trying to coach a beginner up to do a, let's say, 5K, 10K, or even a half marathon?
Really, for the most part, it's just to get them in some good habits. I really try to get them in a mentality to not rush too much. Often with beginners, they're really eager to get things going. They're motivated. I try to get them to, get into doing some strength work, some mobility. And then I try to attack some frequency with their running and to keep those pretty short. But just to build the frequency and that will depend quite a bit depending on the athletic level, whether it's someone who has played sport their whole life, even if it wasn't running, or versus someone who is literally from the couch is trying to get into running or any kind of fitness activity. So in the early stages, it's just getting used to running and getting the body used to running and making sure that they're healthy and everything. And then from there we start increasing the volume, intensity, even paying attention to nutrition.
Yeah, it is amazing in terms of, obviously the, 6, 7, 8 times body weight coming down every time the foot comes down with running, something that I learned from Trent Stellingworth. And, for yourself, when you talk about these frequencies with your new runners, is this, how short would those sessions be? And is there a certain frequency that you're looking at through the week to try to get those exposures in?
Yeah, well, again, this can vary quite a bit. And I'm going to say typically somewhere between 3 to 4 runs is pretty usual to see with runners so that they can have a recovery day in between each one of those runs. And they'll be, early on, it could be 20 to 30 minutes. It's very easy to forget that it takes way longer for like ligaments and all your connective tissues. It takes longer for those to get used to running more than your muscles. So often people, even if they're able to run pretty fast, it doesn't necessarily mean that like their body is ready for the impact. So yeah, try to keep it to like 3, maybe 4 runs a week, and keep those to about 30 minutes or so. And in there, I might add in like some strides and some drills to kind of like ease in that transition into intensity. But for the most part, I try to keep those at a very easy effort level.
Terrific. I mean, when you talk about some of those drills that you might use, let's imagine now, you're building out this beginner into maybe a 10K or a half marathon, or trying to increase their volume. What type of drills or things that you would do to introduce either more volume or more intensity?
Sorry, so like what kind of drills I would introduce?
Yeah, what kind of drills do you typically go to help athletes, beginners who are coming into the 10K half marathon for the first time, to build up that intensity?
I mean, the simple ones are like the A, B, and C's. And as of lately, especially, I've been focusing more on kind of like the A and C's, which is like the high knee and the butt kicks, that people call them, because they're pretty simple drills to do. Most people have done a form of it, even if I find often they might not be doing it the proper way. But like I just, fine tune a little bit how they do their drills, and really focus on those, and the power to the ground and your tendons, Achilles tendons specifically, to like get used to that impact to the ground being explosive. And it's also a great way to build strength in lower legs overall. If you have that, and then you add in a few strides, possibly on hills, it's a great way to make a runner stronger without putting too much impact on the body.
Nice. Yeah, it's not exactly always intuitive, is it, for beginners when they go through these drills, and just the sensation, the feeling of the foot contact on the ground, and that idea of having some explosiveness doesn't always come easy for folks, does it?
No, some folks have been out of like explosive movements like that for a very long time. It's different if you're coming from an athletic background, whether it's soccer, football, or anything really. That will come a little bit more naturally. But if it's someone who's kind of hasn't been active since high school, maybe it's been 10, 15, 20 years since they've done much explosive, then yeah, it will take a little while to get used to it.
And if we shift gears here a little bit and talk about maybe an intermediate runner that's preparing for, let's say, a half marathon and building up the miles, what would a sample training week or even an overarching training block look like for those folks?
Yeah, for those runners, well, we can start being a little bit more specific, whereas like the beginner runners, it's really just to get them running. But for intermediate and advanced, like then we can get more specific with intervals, with long runs. In terms of frequency, they might be running 5 to 7 days a week, and there's even some that will have some doubles in there. I'm a huge fan of doubles when possible. I know that's more of a more advanced level, and sometimes it's even an issue time-wise to fit in. But I find it helps a lot, again, to build that frequency in, and it can even help to recover from the harder efforts. And those doubles sometimes are even cross-training. So I love putting in some spinning, elliptical, pool running. It's all great tools to put into your overall running training. And then, yeah.
And as an intermediate runner, as you're building out this volume, are there certain benchmarks that you're looking for in terms of whether it's total distances covered, or in terms of the intensity of some of the shorter sessions that you're trying to achieve and to prepare for a half marathon?
For a half marathon, I mean, if someone's like more like I definitely like for sure more than like 50 kilometers a week is starting to be a good place to be. But again, that can be a very wide range, anywhere from 50 to, there's some that will run up to 150 plus kilometers a week.
Wow.
But overall, it's kind of like I like sticking to the 80-20% rule,
Mm-hmm.
where you have like 80% of your volume is at a pretty easy effort, and then 20% or so is at higher intensity.
And that seems to be one of those rules that a lot of beginners tend to break, or even intermediates, in terms of, perhaps running faster than they realize they're running, or being a bit more glycolytic versus really building that aerobic base and going slow enough to kind of build that up. Is that, something that you see, and how do you help coach them up to be able to keep it in that aerobic zone?
Yeah, that can be a very big challenge with newer runners. They'll go way too fast on their easy runs. So often, I try to turn the easy runs into more of like a whole social thing, and learn them to enjoy the process, and to have some nice scenic routes. Run with people that maybe their fitness levels a little lower than they are.
Nice.
And some people with, I'm not a huge fan of using heart rate monitors during training, but if there's one place that I do like them, it's for easy runs. And that can be like a good way for some people just to have the visual cue of seeing, to keep their heart rate, say, lower than 140 or whatever their easy effort is. That can be a good way to help them doing that.
Yeah, that's interesting in terms of the heart rate monitors, to be able to really act as a bit of a governor, so they don't go above that. And curious for yourself in terms of not using the heart rate monitors at different intensities. Is that just more relying on subjective wellness, or from your experience, just in terms of how you've prepared? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of gadgets really for most of my training, and I think that's something I've picked up from the coaches I've had in the past. I've been very lucky to have some great coaches early on that has a lot of experience, and most of them were kind of like the old school mentality, where you go by effort, and you go by your last race effort. So say if I'm thinking of like a tempo or like threshold effort. I go off of like my last race, and I'll use like convert into like a 1 hour race pace,
Mm-hmm.
and that will be my threshold effort. And usually I'll hold that until either I race again and improve my times, or if it's been like 6 to 8 weeks and I'm using the same pace, and I'm seeing that like a few weeks in a row I'm really like nailing all my workouts, and it's starting to be a little comfortable, then I'll kind of up that. And I find though, like with years now, I just kind of know. It's like my coach that I have right now, Dave Reed, like he rarely talks about pacing at workouts.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, okay, go at this effort, and I go at that effort.
And those are efforts that are effectively, you're working off the time then, or subjective perception as well, or both?
Yeah, both. So like typically, like he'll be like about like 10K effort kind of thing, and then we'll take a look at the pace, or sometimes he will give me a ballpark of a pace, but we're not too obsessed with the exact numbers, because the terrain we run on can vary quite a bit, temperature and everything. So, but yeah, we do have a good ballpark of both paces and effort.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, it's such a great point in terms of we always talk about the art and the practice, and of course the art form of over the years gaining that knowledge and understanding of how your body feels and works, and being able to go off of that idea of the coach's eye. And it really is fascinating being juxtaposed with all the data and all the metrics that people are, trying to collect, or, oftentimes collecting without a real understanding or reason of why they're collecting it. And so the data can act as a bit of confusion rather than making things simpler. So I like that idea. And,
Yeah.
circling back to what you mentioned there on the two-a-days, I'm curious to see, when did you start to feel that was a real benefit for you? And can you give us an example of some of the ones that you might throw in for some of your clients?
Well, yeah, like again, a lot of my training is based on either like my own personal experiences, and then a lot of research I do on my own time. But like when I started adding doubles in, I believe in 2000. 2008 or so, and I found that like as soon as I started adding double, my injury rate went dipped down by quite a bit. Um,
Interesting.
and yeah, so a big fitness boost and everything. I think it really just comes down to again the frequency. Your body, just adapts more stimulus to adapt to, and you can, especially in the early stages, you can keep this, the same volume or even go up in volume, but have each individual run to be a little bit shorter. So, instead of having to do, say, if I have to run 130 kilometers in singles, that's starting to be fairly long runs. But then if I split up with, 2, 3, 4, maybe up to 5 doubles, I can bring it up to 100 miles, 160 kilometers pretty easily. And that's probably a similar type of stress on the body. But because it's broken down into smaller chunks, it makes it a lot more easier to deal with.
That's terrific. And when we talk about more of these, common mistakes, if we look at this idea of the intermediate runner now training for this half marathon, what are some common mistakes that you see with clients that you're coaching that you need to correct?
Definitely the running too fast still on the easy runs, like we mentioned earlier, is always a big one.
Gotcha.
And then not taking any time off can be a really big one. Whether that's like after a big goal race and they'll kind of jump right back into the next phase of training, or not taking like not taking a day off completely every week. Not saying that every single runner needs to do that, but I think it's something you need to identify for yourself. That's something that you need or not. Lack of strength work, mobility, strides, and all that stuff. I find often, I try to implement that with the beginners, but then when they get, have more experience and stuff like that, and things go well, it can be easy to forget the basics. Mm-hmm. So I find that even for myself, when things go well, I kind of forget about the basics and all those small little things that really adds up at the end, because it's not as sexy when it's all stuff that you're doing on your own at home that you don't really, it's not like going out and running some fast K repeats.
For sure.
Yeah, so forgetting the basics, I think, might be a big thing for intermediate runners.
And Rejean, when you talk strides there, is that stride length, stride frequency, both even for those types of runners?
So strides would be kind of like a 20-second acceleration, really,
Gotcha.
is what I'm talking about, at about like a 85 to 90% effort. So it's fast, but well under control. And yeah, it's a good time to practice good form. And for those, like, it's like very long recovery in between. Like, the goal is not to build fatigue like you would into a workout. So you want to have plenty of recovery in between. It shouldn't be an all-out effort. And it's just to practice the running fast, really.
Fantastic. And now, Rejean, if we kind of zoom back out here, I cut you off when we were talking about your background, your career. You'd built up to these sort of half marathons, and we dove into this conversation around how you can support beginners, intermediates. So for yourself, again, if we go back to your career around running marathons, can you walk us through again, at what point you started doing that and some of the successes you had?
Well, I ran, from 2008 to beginning of 2011. It was mostly kind of higher level 10Ks and half marathons. And then when I moved to Toronto here, I started working with, at the time they had the Brooks Marathon Project, it was called. And it was a program sponsored by Brooks, of course. And we had a bunch of runners living in a house here in Toronto just by High Park, coached by Hugh Cameron. And it was a program based on marathons mainly. So from there, when I moved here, beginning of 2011, started training for a marathon right away, pretty much, till I ran my first marathon here in Toronto at Scotiabank Waterfront Marathon in 2011, and ran 2:17 was my first one.
Wow.
And one of the things, like kind of like we were mentioning earlier, people rushing in too much. For me, I ran so many years before running my first marathon that the training in itself didn't really change that much from what I used to do. So it didn't seem very scary. Like I was already running pretty high volume even before I was training for marathons. So really it was just about being a little bit more specific, the long runs being a tiny bit longer. But so it wasn't really that big of a change. And then in 2012, I won the Canadian Championships in Ottawa for my second marathon.
Wow. Not bad for a second marathon.
Yeah, it was good. It's pretty cool. Not something when I first started running, definitely didn't think I would ever consider, call myself Canadian marathon champ. So that was cool. And yeah, from there I started having some health issues, or some issues with my back. So I kind of start slowing down the higher level running and start coaching a lot more, and launch my own business, Pace and Mind, in 2014, and that really picked up. So elite running kind of took a back seat.
Absolutely. And if we, pick your brain a little bit on those days where you're progressing into the elite status and winning the, national championships, you touched on it a little bit, but what are some of the, for coaches listening in, for runners listening in who really want to up their game, what were some of those key training points, whether it's volume, intensity, mindset, even of how you then progress yourself onto that, up a notch to that elite level?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a tough balance, and that's something that even sometimes not sometimes, very often I look back at when I was at a higher level of the mistakes I made, and it's a tough balance between wanting to be so intense all the time, pushing the limits, pushing the volume, the intensity in workouts. So it's really about being well-rounded in all of those different aspects to recover from them. Like recovery is such a huge aspect that I didn't really pay enough attention back when I was at that level, and paying attention to my nutrition, and again trying to do too much because I was a late starter. I felt like I was always running with a chip on my shoulder. So I would run, I've run up to 300 kilometers a week, and now when I think about that, I'm like, yeah, that was probably over the limit. Like that was a little bit too much. There's no real point to that. But yeah, I'd say to pay attention to each aspect and to periodize everything. So certain different times of the year, different, you want to be pushing your volume a little bit more, or maybe you want to work a bit more on your speed, work a little bit more on your threshold level, whatever it is. But it's very hard to do everything all at once. So you have to change throughout the year what you're trying to hit, while keeping everything in the mix also. I don't believe in taking any one aspect out completely, because then it can get pretty hard to add it back in. So even if the goal is not necessarily to be running super fast intervals, just to still have that very short workout once in a while in the background is still very important.
Absolutely, yeah. You want to maintain those qualities, I imagine, for when you do need them down the road. And for somebody who's laying out a calendar for yourself, if you're working with a more elite, sub-elite recreational runner, is there a certain amount of events that you're looking for them to peak for in a year that's reasonable or typical for you?
Yeah, if someone's looking to train for marathon specifically, I don't like going more than 2 a year. There's the odd time it might happen up to 3 if needed, if someone's trying to qualify for teams or something like that. But typically 2 a year, 2 marathons a year is a good place to be. And even every few years, I do like a runner going a full year without running a marathon. I find there's this thing with runners that if you run one marathon, you're now a marathoner.
Nice.
Same thing with it goes even more with ultra marathoners, where you run one ultra and you're now an ultra marathoner. Whereas I feel like you should just be a runner. You should be a runner. You should be an athlete. So you should focus on marathons for a few years maybe, and then drop it back and focus on 5Ks and 10Ks. So it keeps that interesting. and it's just better to keep you healthy for a long term and to keep the consistency up, because I mean, consistency really at the end of it is what's going to make you the best runner that you can be.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and one that's been hammered home, thankfully by other experts who've come on the show around whether it's strength and conditioning, nutrition, this idea of consistency really being the king overall, and how, just as you mentioned here today, unfortunately, beginners, intermediates are in such a hurry to get, their miles up or to see some of those results that it can come at a compromise of that consistency. And, if we continue to talk about the marathons here, Rejean, if you're thinking 2 marathons a year, and I think that's a great heuristic as well, just to dovetail into, you mentioning changing those distances is sort of a natural way of modulating volume as well, isn't it, from year to year? So that's terrific as well. If someone's building up to those couple of marathons and they're in that sort of elite status, is there a certain, how far out are you starting that training for them, or that preparation, let's say? And could you maybe roughly walk us through what some of those blocks look like?
Yeah, typically I start what you would call a specific marathon build-up about 3 months out, is roughly when I'd start. But again, when you're especially at a higher level, it's not really that big of a change when it comes to training. The long runs will typically go up to 35K or so. Mm-hmm. Sometimes longer. Like, I'm not against running a full marathon distance, but again, that depends on how fast you are and how long you're going to be on your feet.
How long it takes you, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like I don't like a runner going over, say, like 3.5 hours or so. It's kind of like the longest I'll go. But if you're someone who runs, 220 or in that range, then running even a marathon at a training pace will be, well under 3 hours. So it's not as much of an issue.
Nice. And in terms of those, as you build up those blocks, is there a certain sequence that you tend to rely on with that elite athletes would follow to build up for a marathon?
It changes it around a little bit with me. I'm not really set on the one way of doing things. There might be, like, for one specific runner where I would see that, like, okay, for that runner, we like to start things with a lot more speed and build into more like threshold long intervals. But I do change it a little bit depending on how the past buildup went and what I feel like they need going into the next one. But the one thing that is pretty consistent throughout my buildups is that the later I get into the buildup, the more specific I get. So early on in the early stage of a buildup, I don't really touch on even like marathon pace that much. But it's just during the last 6 weeks or so, I'll start doing more and more marathon pace. And also, it's kind of a good way, since it's lower intensity, it's a good way to get them to the start line healthy. So I'll add some marathon pace in intervals, and then even in long runs for some people.
Fantastic. And, now if we talk about race day, it's time to perform, whether you're intermediate, whether you're on the sort of elite side of things. What are some tips or tactics that you might use with clients? Maybe give us some of the, your strategies when you were winning championships, and how the mindset plays a role in all this.
Yeah, mindset is huge. And again, I find that consistency kind of goes into that. A lot of people ask me, like, how do you get mentally prepared going into a race and, having confidence and all that? It starts way before the race day. Like, if you've nailed your training the last 3, 4, 5 months, even if things didn't go perfectly, but you kept up with your cross training or whatever it is, and especially if you have that on paper, you can look back and that will build confidence right there when you see all the work you've put in.
For sure.
And I really believe in visualization. So visualizing both how you hope the race will go, and then even visualize how, when you have issues along the way, how are you going to deal with that? If you're starting to feel low in energy, something's a little bit wrong. You don't feel like you have as much power as you would hope. What will you do? Well, you slow down the pace a little bit for a kilometer or two, take an extra gel, and then you kind of imagine yourself starting to feel good again, starting to pass some runners around you. So I'm a big believer in visualization. And for marathon, especially the fueling is a huge part, and that again goes into practice for the months before. So we do practice our fueling a lot during long runs. So then when you get on race day, you just do what you've practiced the whole 3 months before your goal race. So it's just kind of like, just practice.
Nice. And in terms of that fueling as you build up on those longer runs toward what you're going to do on the marathon day, again, are there certain parameters you're looking for in terms of grams of carbohydrate per hour? Does that depend on the level of athlete that you're working with?
It'll vary a little bit between individual, but it's usually somewhere between 40 to 60 grams per hour. And that's something that you can improve with time. So again, with practice, with doing it every week, you can train your stomach to take in more carbs,
Sure.
whether it's sports drink or gel. Because and it takes a while to practice. It doesn't come natural to a lot of people, but you have to practice every single week. Take in some water with it to dilute the gels and to help digestion. But 40 to 60 grams is a good place to be.
And for yourself, again, when you're competing at the highest level, were there any supplements that you were adding in, whether it's caffeine, things like that, along with the gels to support performance?
Yeah, I did take gels. Caffeine. I did add caffeine both before the race and also during the race. So for me, I was lucky that I had the luxury of having elite bottles along the way.
Nice.
So actually, the gels that I used didn't have caffeine in the gels, but I actually crushed caffeine pills and put them in my bottles. I don't know if this is common or not. So that's what I did. I would crush half, so I would put about 100 milligrams of caffeine every 10K or so. So I would have like 2 to 3 during the race.
Nice. And then, along the way, obviously, caffeine's going to help with things like perceived exertion, which is pretty helpful when you're pushing the intensity like that. What about on the tactic side of things? Did it vary from race to race? Did you have a specific tactic in mind, or was that something that you would sort of flush out as the race is going on and you get a sense of how you're feeling?
Well, for me, for the races I've done, since I've never done, it's a little different if you're trying more to hit a specific time or effort or whatever it is, or if you're trying to win a race. In the race situations that I've been in, for a marathon anyway, was more about having a goal of hitting a certain time. So, I'd go in with a pace in mind and go out at that pace. But of course, that would depend. We kind of had like my A goal if everything, the conditions were great. And then on race day, we kind of adjust from there depending on how, if it's warm out, if it's windy or whatever it is. And then sometimes that's something I would even adjust mid-race, depending on, if there's a pack of runners or something that's going a little bit faster than what I had in mind, then maybe I'm better off to go a little bit faster, but have people to share the workload with instead of sticking to my original pace, but just being in no man's land.
Yeah, it's fascinating how if you're going for the win, how things might change like that around dragging behind some runners and get that save a little energy on that side is pretty good tactic.
Yeah.
And over the years, Rejean, you mentioned nutrition, recovery. Back when you sort of started, you obviously had strategies, but it sort of evolved and things have changed even on just what we know in terms of the science of recovery and nutrition. So for you, are there things that, even though you're not racing at the elite level now, what are some of the things that have maybe changed over your career that you do now that you didn't do then?
I've probably taken more protein than I used to. So that's kind of like one of the simple ones to try to get in at least 1 gram per pound of body weight. to take in enough food overall, really take in enough calories. Especially again at a higher level, we're already very lean, so it's easy to it's just easy to monitor. If we see that, if I'd rather have too much food than not enough, really. If I saw that, with time I'm kind of gaining a little bit weight, can't say it really happened with the amount of miles that are even still run these days. It's next to impossible to gain weight.
Nice.
But it's a good problem to have. But yeah, I'd rather go on the very cautious side and eat a little bit extra food versus just trying to lose weight, especially if you're trying to build, you're in the build up for a race. I really don't believe that's a good time to try to cut weight or anything like that.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it, to ensure you got enough fuel and energy on board to be able to support the training, the adaptations, the recovery that are going on. Even on the immune front, we know that if you get into a caloric deficit, if your protein intake isn't sufficient, if your energy intake isn't sufficient, then the immune system takes a big hit. And of course, if you're catching colds and flus, then that's going to come back and impair your ability to do that most important thing, which you mentioned, which is consistency. If you're sick and tired, run down, you can't be consistent. So those are some great points. And today, Rejean, with your with Pace in mind and all the different clients and folks that you see, I know community is a big part of running. Can you talk a little bit about some of the groups that you work with and the community and mental side of things?
Yeah, running with, that's a big part, I think, why people join Pace in Mind, or also coach at One Academy on the East End. And it's to have the community aspect. And I can't say that being a runner, you're an outsider or anything like that now, because running is pretty popular all around, but still to be with a group of people who have the same mindset, has similar goals and everything, it just makes going out for runs at 5:30 a.m. normal. Same for me. That was a big reason why I joined the group, Brooks Marathon Project here. Is just I wasn't like a weirdo of running 100 miles a week and waking up early and doing all my runs. So even here within Pace in Mind, that's a big part of it. You have people pushing you every end of a workout. It helps with the mental side of it, especially during the winter months when it's dark out. You don't really feel like going out, but if you're meeting a group, it makes things a lot easier mentally.
Yeah, it's something that I emphasize so much with clients, recreational clients that come into clinic, of being able to find a group and joining a club or something like Pace in Mind, to be able to get that community bond, make some friends, and then all of a sudden those training sessions are really a chance to just connect with people you enjoy hanging around with, and the exercise, for some people where it's not a priority for their to hit a PB necessarily, but to just get fit, it's just a huge part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, it just ends up being part of the whole lifestyle, I find, because then the people you're training with probably end up being some pretty close friends, and they have a pretty healthy lifestyle, and you can still have fun along the way and go out for some beers after the runs or whatever it is. But yeah, it makes things a lot easier.
Awesome. Well, listen, Rejean, I want to respect your time here today. So, last question for you is, if you had to give one tip, and maybe we'll give one tip to a beginner and one tip to elite, if you can spare two tips here. But yeah, one thing that you might tell a beginner who's getting into running, preparing for a marathon, and one tip that you might give someone who's at that elite level to really help them get over the hump, what would those be?
Get in touch with an expert in those early stages. I find now with social media and everything, a lot of people are experts.
For sure.
So get in touch with someone, whether it's because they have a lot of letters behind their name, who's been in the game for a very long time, and get in touch with someone that you trust, and to show you the basics of it. I guess that would be my tip for the beginners, and for the faster folks, I think it would still be to remember to look long term. it's so easy to forget how, if you look at who are the best in the sport right now, for the most part, they're still in their mid to late 30s. You get a lot of runners in their late 30s winning medals, winning big city marathons, and that can be easy to forget when you're 25, that you still have 10 years ahead of you, 10-year plus, really. So is to not act like your next season is the end all be all, and to go step by step. Don't forget the basics.
Phenomenal. I love it. Yeah, fundamentals and having that real long term goal and valuing consistency is so crucial, and something that, again, experts in all sorts of various fields that we cover here, those are some big pillars for them as well. So that's pretty cool. Well, listen, terrific, Rejean. I appreciate you carving out some time today. Where can people stay connected with you and keep up with all the work that you're doing?
Mostly, I think the easiest place would be Instagram, I guess. Not that I can't say I'm a huge social media person, but I have my personal account. That's Coach Rejean. Rejean spelled Rejean. And then there's also my Pace and Mind account, just Pace and Mind. That would probably be the best, or by email, which is rejean@paceandmind.com.
Awesome. So if folks are looking to get in touch with you, if in the Toronto area or anyone looking for, remote support, that would be the best place to go then.
Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Well, listen, thanks again for taking the time, Rejean, and best of luck in all your training this summer.